Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to do the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion remaster with the real minimum requirement. We're going to find out what is the real hardware, the minimum you can go to play the game. A quick recap of the minimum. The proposed minimum requirement is the Ryzen 5 2600X or the i7 6800K. And if you remember my past video, if you have less than 6 logical core, you get a warning that the game will be unstable. Then 16GB of RAM, and for the GPU you have the RX 5700 or the GeForce GTX1660 Ti. And by the way, if your GPU have less than 6GB of VRAM, you'll get a warning that the game need at least 6GB of VRAM. Welcome to Response PC, I'm Dunk, let's game on. Starting off at the testing, we have the GTX980 Ti, a little drop from the GTX1070 Ti, about 20% in performance, and for the CPU we drop from the i7 6800K to the i7 5820K, and we kept the 16GB of RAM for now. We're playing at 1080p, lowest settings, and we want to reach 30 FPS without upscaling, and we get an average of 50 FPS, so we're still quite far from the 30 FPS goal. The GPU is using 5GB of VRAM out of 6. The CPU is in the mid 40s, so both the GPU and CPU can go lower, and for the RAM we're using 13.4, so I don't think we can go lower than 16GB of RAM so far. Now a quick test, same CPU, i7 5820K, 16GB of RAM, but the GTX 970. This is 4GB VRAM or 3.5GB VRAM depending on who's you're asking, but even at 720p, low settings and FSR performance Vaseline mode, we only get 26 FPS, just because the card have less than 6GB of VRAM. So we're going to only test 6GB VRAM card or more. Next up, let's put back the GTX 980 Ti, since we know the GPU can do the job. Let's drop the CPU to the i7 3770. This is now a 4-core 8-thread CPU, meaning we only have 4 logical core, which is under the 6 that the game recommend. And we're going to see if it affect the game or not. Having 4 logical core instead of 6 logical core is as affect the 6GB of VRAM versus 4GB of VRAM. We are still at 1080p, lowest settings and no upscaling, and we get an average of 40 FPS. We lost a little bit of FPS. We may have a core or 2 or a thread that is bottlenecking the rest of the system. The GPU is still running okay with a 5.2GB of VRAM out of 6. The CPU we are in the 60 and sometimes in the mid 70% of utilization. And remember, this is an average of all the core/thread of the CPU, so some core are higher than that to give this average, but it's running fine without any stutter, so I guess it's a pass for now. Now let's keep the i7 3770 but jump to the lowest, less performing 6GB VRAM GPU from NVIDIA, the GTX1660 6GB variant. I also dropped the RAM to 8GB, which by the way was a bad idea, because now we have a RAM bottleneck. Literally, the CPU is struggling like hell after reaching 80 to 90% of utilization and dropping to the mid 40, 90. The GTX 1060 6GB variant seems to be able to do the job, but the rest of the system is struggling to keep up. Otherwise at that, we get a 32 FPS average, but with peak at the 40s and lows in the teens FPS. The stutter is everywhere and lasts quite a bit. Jumping to the AMD side of things, starting by the lowest, the Ryzen 3 1200. This is a 4-core 8-thread, so we get the warning message about not having enough logical core of 6, 16GB of RAM, and the RX 580. This is a 8GB VRAM card, so we don't get the warning message for at least the GPU. Playing at 1080p, lowest settings, I need to enable FSR balance to have some kind of a playable experience, and we still get 32 FPS, heavy starter, and a drop in FPS in the teens. We have a CPU bottleneck, often reaching 98% of utilization, and having the GPU utilization drop in the mid-50s often. Switching the CPU to the Ryzen 5 1500X, still with 16GB of RAM and the RX 580 8GB variant, at 1080p lowest settings, we still need FSR balance to be able to play properly, at least at decent FPS. We now have an average of 37, it's more stable than the Ryzen 3 1200, but we still have 4-core 8-thread CPU. We less often reaching a core in the high 90s, making it more smooth and more stable, but you still need FSR to be able to have a decent FPS. The GPU is in the 90s, but not pegged at 100% or 99%, using 5.9 GB of VRAM out of 8. The CPU is in the 70 to high 80s and sometimes hitting the low 90s. For the RAM, we're using 11.6. It's a playable experience, I say. Finally, upgrading the CPU to the Ryzen 5 1600. This is the lowest 6-core. This is a 6-core 12-thread. So this is the lowest 6-core logical core that you can go on the Ryzen side to not have the game give you a warning about the logical core. I also put in the RX 480 8GB at 1080p lowest settings, since we already know the RX 580 will do the job. This is the lowest you can go in GPU term. I mean, there's also the R9 390, but I don't have one, so that will be the RX 480 as my lowest VRAM GPU. I mean, at least over 6GB VRAM. And the GPU is doing quite well, giving us an average of 37 FPS. The GPU utilization is in the 90s. For some reason, every GPU I test mostly will be in the 90s instead of being pegged at 100%, using 6.3 out of 8GB VRAM. CPU wise, we are in the mid 50s, so we don't have any bottleneck there, and using 13.7GB of RAM. And finally, the i5 9600K. I want to test a 6-core 6-thread CPU, which don't have a 6-core 12-thread or have any thread overhead. And I put with the GTX1660 Super, another 6GB VRAM card, just to see how it goes. And it goes quite well. We can play at 1080p, medium settings, no upscaling, and get an average of 42 FPS. GPU peg at 99%, using 5.6GB of VRAM out of 6, and the CPU is in the mid 60s, sometimes hitting 70 or even 80% of utilization, and the RAM we are at 12.6 out of 16. And the frame time was quite stable and smooth. So, what are our winner? Our winner will be a CPU with 6 logical core, 16GB of RAM, and a GPU with 6GB of VRAM. That means for the CPU we have the Ryzen 5 1600, 6-core 12-thread, the i5 8400, this is a 6-core 6-thread. I didn't show you in this video, but I've tested. And i7 3770, even though it's a 4-core 8-thread, it was able to manage the game adequately. But keep in mind it may get harder for the CPU later in game. For the GPU we have the GTX1660 6GB variant, the RX 480 8GB, and the A380. This is a 6GB card, was featured in my video Oblivion on Intel Arc GPU, and that's all I have. Keep in mind I don't have every CPU and GPU that exists, so I may have some variation that able or not able to do the job. Thanks for watching, see you in the next one, and subscribe.